Hey everyone, it's the host of All Across America, Marco Vig. Thank you for being a listener. The show is free, of course. All I ask of you is that you share it with friends and give us a review on Spotify or Apple. And it would be great to hear from you. We're on Instagram at All Across America or visit our new website, allacrossamerica.com. I try to respond personally to everybody who reaches out, so say hello. All right, on with the show. Podcasting from Portland East to Portland West, from Big Pine Key to Pacific Beach, and from San Juan to Guam, this is All Across America. All right. Well, Annie, thanks so much for joining us. And we were talking a little bit about how you got it started, Moss. And if I may read from the introduction to your book, The Magical World of Moss Gardening. And you start with the book saying, every time I walk out of my front door, my mosses greet me. The magic of my garden engulfs my spirit, and that internal smile instantly moves to my face. As I gaze at the dazzling mosaic of mosses in my garden, I feel immense joy and pride juxtaposed with calm. I love that.
Well, actually, I could rewrite that intro now because I took out a stone fireplace and put in a picture window in my living room. I don't have to walk out the front door anymore. I get to see it 24/7. It's
Wow.
it really, I don't know anybody else that modifies their house to suit their garden, but that's what I did.
I like that. You know, we had a fireplace that was unused, and we ended up taking out parts of it so we could see out into our garden. So I think we're two kindred spirits here. There was no mantle really involved. It was an unworkable fireplace.
Oh,
But
mine was a workable one, but it was heavy stone and it was starting to compromise the house.
fair
And
enough.
I just thought, and it was the reason I bought the house. I
Hmm.
loved the stone fireplace.
Really?
But having the opportunity to gaze upon my mosses anytime I want makes a huge difference.
So how did you get into mosses?
I grew up in the mountains of Western North Carolina, and I have watched economic development occur my entire lifetime. That means that many of our mountains, uh, which don't fall in the protected forest or park category,
Right.
have been dramatically changed. I'm trying really hard not to be negative in my response and couch it somehow in positive terms. We have
Yes.
been enriched by many people with talents that have moved to the mountains, but those very same people that are drawn to the natural environment and the diversity of plants that exist here are the ones that have destroyed the mountains.
Yeah.
So it's kind of ironic. So as a local, I have a different perspective. Anyhow, I just couldn't stand to see mosses being destroyed. And it doesn't just happen when the loggers come in and new housing communities are built, but it also happens in urban locations as well. Roofers and insurance people have convinced homeowners that mosses are bad and should be removed. Well, that's not truly the case, particularly when it comes to asphalt shingles. Now, cedar shake, it's a little different because they're
Yeah.
wood, but asphalt shingles are pristinely new when I remove the mosses from off of the top of them. And all of the rest of the roof is severely degraded and brittle and um, just decaying, essentially.
Yeah.
But if they don't want to believe me, then I will climb up on the roof and get these mosses because typically they will be heat tolerant and oftentimes sun tolerant moss species as well.
Oh,
Now, mind
okay.
you, I'm not going to climb up more than a 412 pitch, but
Yeah,
uh,
I'm with you
I'm
there.
not doing these alpine style houses with those
No
roofs
thanks.
that are so pointy. Uh, but looking forward to the opportunities and having my moss radar on all the time. Mosses can be found on the edges of parking lots. They grow on asphalt. They're excellent species to utilize in moss landscapes. And then There are actually some people out there that don't want moss in their yards. They want to have those expansive grass lawns, and it has been the bane of most landscape companies, um, businesses, to always have to deal with the underlayment of moss that they can't seem to get rid of. Well, there are several reasons why, and we can talk about the botanical characteristics that make mosses a good choice in your home landscape or even a commercial landscape as well.
Let's hear it.
Oh, you want to hear them right this second? Okay.
Yeah, let's do
All
it.
right. Well, mosses are different from all other plants in the world. First of all, they're the oldest living land plants on our planet.
Wow.
That's 450 million years ago, mosses first appeared on Earth. And um, that the scientific term for moss is bryophyta, or in anglicized, it would be bryophyte. So I may use those terms, but in the bryophyta classification, it includes mosses, liverworts, and hornworts. And in the world, there are like 10 to 12,000 plus moss species. There's 8 to 10,000 plus liverworts, but only 100 little hornworts. And Mark, we actually have one that is located here in North Carolina, and its second name is Carolinius. So second names in terms of scientific terminology usually indicates the way it grows, like repens means growing sideways.
Oh,
Carolinius or canadensis means Carolina or Canada is where it was found. And then sometimes the second name reflects the person that found it.
okay.
Anyhow, that's just a little sideline about scientific terminology. And by the way, it's not Latin terms. They are Greek and Latin terms
Okay.
combined to
Good to
create
know.
this scientific terminology. For instance, poly, which is a Greek term, and you might think of polygon, or there's all kinds of other poly words we use in the English language, but it does mean many sided. And so that's the Greek part of the word. The trichum part is the Latin. So anything that ends with AE typically is a Latin origin.
Okay.
So, all right. Now, what are the botanical characteristics? Oh my goodness. They are so fascinating. And but before I move on, I want to just mention that as old as the mosses are, they are 50 million years older than any other plant on our planet. So
Wow.
it took a long time for those ferns in the trees and all the other components of our environment to start growing on our planet. Now, you've heard some of these scientists talking about uh, or how the trees are communicating with the fungi. Well, guess what? Who started that conversation 50 million years before that? It was the mosses, and they never left the conversation. They are always a part of that uh, analysis of communication that occurs among plants. But oftentimes, mosses are overlooked by scientists. They're ignored or cause irritation with landscapers. But there are a few of us that embrace mosses. So that's how I wanted to connect that mosses are an integral part of any ecosystem. They support the wildlife habitat, providing habitats, as well as occasional food sources, but not much. There are only a few birds that like to eat sporophytes. Most um, critters dislike the taste of mosses. They really taste bad. And so not even deer will eat them,
Which
which
is
it's
good news for gardeners.
it
Very good
certainly
news.
can be. All right, now let's talk about how do mosses differ from other plants. I'm going to refer to all the other plants in the world essentially as vascular. And
Okay.
that means if you think back to when you were in your early science classes in elementary school and learned about the parts of a plant, And I'm sure you can recall some of those. Uh, the flower, the seeds, the stem, the leaves, and the roots. Now, we don't have to get so far out as to be talking about the stamen and the pistil. That's unimportant. But the internal system with the xylem and the phloem do not exist in most species. They are non lignin plants. That means they don't derive their nutrients through roots. Instead, they have rhizoids. Now, one of the purposes of a root was to hold the plant in place. The other is to feed the plant. The only purpose of a rhizoid is to hold it to whatever substrate it's growing to. And the rhizoids are tiny, so they can permeate into the smallest of cracks in pavement, concrete. Oh, that's something to follow up on. Remember to ask me about that mention there, because that relates to pH, Mark.
Okay.
Anyhow, so they have rhizoids, and instead of flowers, they have sporophytes with spore capsules that contain spores that would be the equivalent of a seed. However, they're microscopic in size. So anybody that thought has ever tried to purchase spores online, you're getting rooked, because if you get a little packet of dirt, first of all, they're microscopic. I guess they've got to put some dirt in the packet so you see something.
Right.
But
Right.
mosses have other ways that they grow besides through that process. But this first way they reproduce is via this spore production. But you know what they do first, Mark?
What's that?
They have sex. And and each individual moss plant will have male and female parts. The antheridium, where the sperm swim over to the archegonium and fertilize the egg. Now,
Mhm.
instead of making a baby plant right away, they go into the second stage of reproduction, which is this sporophytic stage. And spores are dispersed, they grow like seeds, but they can, once again, because they're microscopic, they can land in all types of surfaces that other plants would never be able to adapt to. All right, second way they reproduce is vegetative reproduction. That's an asexual process. And it's really simple. Sounds kind of complicated, but the reality is it means mosses can grow from fragments of the plants, which I refer to as frags. And the frags can be dispersed on the ground, and they'll grow that way too. And
Wow.
that's why those people that want their grass to be pristinely pure without moss, the more they mow it, it cuts off those dead blades of grass,
And it
but it
fragments it.
cuts off fragments of mosses that will only spread it further
Right.
in your yard.
Right. And I just want to mention for folks that something that I find really interesting as you're walking through that mosses have, correct me if I'm wrong, three different ways of reproducing.
There's one more. So we've talked about the having sex, which they can do in the dead of winter, under the
Oh,
snow blanket even. You know,
sounds cozy.
when that snow melts and you see these splendid sporophytes, which offer glimmering jewel tone colors, crimson, golden, bronze. When they're present, you know your mosses have been having fun out there.
Okay.
And so that's the first way. Second way is growing from fragments of the plants. There's
Mhm.
also in the natural process with mosses, the leaf tips will flake off on certain species. That's how it does it in nature. But we can step in and be proactive by utilizing the fragments as well. The third way is that some moss species have distinctive male and female plants, not just parts, separate plants. And the male cups have these little propagule balls, and they're referred to as Jimmy cups. So Polytrichum and Atricum, in particular, are species that have splendid cups, and they can reproduce that way. So that's three ways that we've got pluses for growing mosses. The best way is to plant them intentionally yourself. rather than waiting to let it grow in because it could take quite a while. You better have a lot of patience if you want to do that. But I will explain how you can encourage growth. Um, let me see if we've covered all the botanical characteristics that I think are the most important. Yes, I believe so. All right. So let's move on to planting methods for mosses.
Right. You mentioned fragmentation, and I know that's one of them.
And then the intentional planting in a solid fashion, which I
Okay.
call a contiguous method, meaning
Right.
they're bumped right next to each other, or the sideways growers are interlaced. Um, and that gives immediate gratification.
Right.
And you don't have to wait for it to grow in. It's
Right.
going to be beautiful from the moment it's planted. And if you provide um, adequate maintenance in terms of leaf debris and other removal of unwanted objects that are gifted to us by all those vascular plants in the world, and provide supplemental watering, then you can be successful. Now, so you can plant solid, you can plant with a combination of utilizing full colonies and fragments, or you can use just fragments. But if you already have existing mosses, then growing in your property or around the areas, look for opportunities to relocate them from places where they're not appreciated to a focal feature where you can enjoy them. That's one thing.
So
If moss,
it's like a hair transplant almost with moss. You're
yes,
cutting.
exactly. That works pretty good. In fact, I could put a toupee on right now and you would love it.
Mm,
Mosses grow two ways primarily, either sideways or upright as mounds. The upright mound colonies will not provide horizontal expansion, only the
uh,
sideways growers. So
okay.
your upright colonies will provide depth and dimension with their various shapes and sizes of the colonies. Sideways growers tend to provide that carpet appearance.
Hmm. And that's
So,
what you want. Or that's
right.
what most people want. Yeah.
Well, but having the textures in there brings together the whole big
R-
creative
Right.
design picture.
Right.
So, yeah, but you're right. Most people just want moss. They'd have
But we're
no
talking, but
idea
that's
of
the
the
one dimension.
differences.
There's so
Right.
much
And
more.
they equate it to a grass lawn. They just want to replace their grass lawn with moss. Well, if you're
Gotcha.
lucky enough to already have mosses as the underlayment in your grass lawn, you can start discouraging the grasses and encouraging the mosses. Number one, mow the grass down to the nubbin. Use the
Mm.
weed eater in the same manner. Just whack everything
All
down
right.
to where it discourages positive growth of grass.
Yeah.
Now, in that process, you may dislodge some moss fragments. That's great because they're just going to spread to new areas.
Yeah.
Now, in terms of maintenance, I do not recommend raking, but for this particular way to encourage moss growth, you can rake existing mosses, and some of them may look pretty good right now, but rake them into the vacant spaces where you want mosses to grow. Now, most importantly, Mark, is that you're going to water and walk on your mosses, whether you planted them solid or whether you're using a fragmentation process or whether you are spreading the existing mosses. And there is a direct correlation to the successful moss landscape and providing adequate water. Mother Nature gives us plenty sometimes.
Right.
Other times she denies us and makes us go through a drought. And you just can't count on her to provide the needs of the mosses to keep them lush and thriving and to get them well established. So I highly recommend that supplemental watering sessions be part of your normal regime of taking
That's
care
good
of
to
your
know.
mosses. Mosses are such different plants. They hydrate quickly, but they can dry out quickly as well. They do not need long drenching soaks like most other plants in your garden. You want to provide several supplemental watering sessions each day that it doesn't rain or there's not high humidity. So, for instance, we have dew on the ground here in the early mornings. So that's the least important time to water the mosses, where it's the most important time if you've got a vegetable garden, in contrast. So you might start like at 10:30 once the dew starts to dry off. That would be your first session. The next session might not be just right in the middle of the day, like at 1:30 in the afternoon.
Mhm.
Doesn't hurt to water mosses at high noon even, and they're not
Mhm.
going to burn. They're not going to get spots. And yeah, even watering at night, I have never had any issues with other plants getting moldy because the sessions are brief. So 10:30, 1:30, and 5 o'clock, those could be your starting points of
Okay.
when you would provide watering, with the most important one being at the end of the day rather
Okay.
than the beginning of the day. The sessions, depending on the type of spray head that you're using and how wide the angle is. If it's a narrow angle, obviously it's going to do it a lot faster. If you're doing your path, for instance, you just need to do that one long shoot. Whereas
Mhm.
if you're trying to do a wider expanse, your uh, perimeter area of where the water hits could take longer to cover it. But basically, 2 to 5 minutes for each session. So
Okay.
it doesn't really take that much water as people think. It just sounds like a lot of water, but in reality, it's far less water. In fact, the EPA has uh, published a statistic that says that mosses require 1/10,000th of the amount of water as a grass lawn.
Wow.
So
Okay.
3 sessions. And so, because even the best moss lover may not be able to keep up with that
Right.
demanding watering regime, I highly recommend the use of a timer controller. You can, of course, have an installed irrigation system put in, but the professionals need to be advised that the moss area should be on a separate zone because you need to
Wow.
have the brief sessions for your moss. Let those long drenching sessions happen for the grass and the trees
That's very different.
elsewhere.
Okay.
If you do it yourself, you can get a controller timer that's battery operated. You can set specific times. Don't get one that just does those increments every 6,
Mhm.
12, 24 hours. You want to
Right.
set the specific time. They even
Okay.
have them now that you can control with your cell phone. So you
Wow.
don't have to be at home. And um, I won't recommend a specific brand. There's not very many out there to choose from. And
Okay.
they're a little obtuse to set up the watering sessions when you first start off. But I also recommend use a good hose, never chintz on your hose. And the last thing is in terms of a sprinkler, an oscillating sprinkler works well
Mhm.
for some large spaces, but I prefer a gear driven sprinkler that's shaped like a Dr. Pepper can. And it allows you to choose the type of spray, just like on your handheld
Right.
sprinkler. You can have flat, shower, mist, that kind of option.
Mhm.
You also can control the throw distance, how far you water or how
Mhm.
close. And best of all, there are these little levers that allow you to go in a narrow angle all the way to 360. So uh, it is important to provide the supplemental watering. Even if you're just letting it grow in, you will find your moss growth will be uh, faster. And that's
All
what
right.
most people are interested in.
Uh,
Now, people bristle about that idea. I mean, they just think, well, mosses just grow in the woods and they look good, and you don't have to clean them up, and you don't have to water them. Well, you're not observant like I am on the ones that have suffered.
Right.
Leaf litter is one of the best ways to kill mosses.
And why is
If
that?
it's They smother them. They don't
Uh-huh.
get any light. Mosses are still plants, Mark.
Right.
People don't seem to put them in some other category and don't realize how wonderful they are in terms of providing this year-round green appeal. And I have to
Yeah.
say that is one of the major reasons I'm involved with mosses. So in
Yes.
the dead of winter, when other gardeners are sitting around whining and pining,
Looking at the
can't
brown.
wait and they're looking at all that brown mulch, pine needles and stuff out there that they've dressed their dormant plants with. And they can't wait for spring to happen. And frankly, wintertime is one of the best seasons to showcase mosses because they don't have a downtime. They are
Right.
immune to the negative effects of cold. Now, they can freeze, but you can
Mhm.
even plant your mosses on frozen ground in the dead of winter if you want
Wow.
to. You just need to make sure that your mosses have thawed out a bit so that they're pliable.
Right. Can we talk a bit about climate and zones? And you're in Redwood, North Carolina, and I've spent some time in Southern Appalachians, and you'd feel like that's one of the best places in the world to grow moss, and Pacific Northwest maybe. But from reading your book, they're basically they grow in all zones. Mo most gardeners are very, very attuned to what zone they're in, making sure their plants don't freeze in the wintertime. But you're saying that's not the case with moss.
Well, they might freeze, but it's not going to harm them at
Right.
all because they are tolerant of sub freezing temperatures. There's one little moss species I just want to bring up as an example. You can find Ceratodon purpureus, which is a tiny miniature moss that's like velvet, and it can grow in the cracks of sidewalks in New York City, Paris, and Kyoto, but it can also be found in Antarctica.
Wow.
So it this particular species is truly a um, an international universal species on our planet. So when
Wow.
people ask, is it a local moss? Well, yes, Ceratodon's local where you live. It's local where I live. It's local on the
Right.
other side of the world. The most important thing is understanding what the environment is like and choosing your moss species, particularly based upon the sun exposure. So, yes, you can utilize mosses in the winter, and that should give you a hint that planting zones that are used in the United States are totally irrelevant
Wow.
because they're based on cold hardiness. Mosses are
Right.
hardy to any temperature. Now, they're less likely to be happy in really hot climates. And so you really have to take extra precautions to support your mosses when you're in an environment where it's sunny and hot all day long.
Sorry for my listeners in Tucson and Yuma.
Well, there are some species that grow in direct sun, and
Mhm.
most people just think mosses are something to choose for a shady place that won't support other plant growth. They might also choose mosses because it's nutrient poor soil. Well, guess what, Mark? Remember, they just have those little rhizoids that just hold them. They
Mhm.
don't draw any nutrients up through a root system like other plants. Mosses eat through their leaves. And if you think about a rhododendron, uh, English ivy, just every other plant literally has a cuticle, which is a waxy substance on the leaf itself, so
Mhm.
that when the rain hits it, it falls to the ground, and that way nutrients are fed to these other plants through their roots. Mosses eat straight through those leaves, and typically many moss species have leaves that are only one cell layer thick. So they hydrate quickly. They can also dry out quickly, however. So
Interesting.
supplemental watering sessions can be most essential. I live in the highest annual rainfall east of the Rocky Mountains.
Really?
Literally, we have between 75 to 115 inches per year in a normal year.
Wow.
So it can exceed that. But even so, a few years back, we went for 53 days without a drop of rain. Mosses don't like to be in a drought. They don't like to have to go thirsty. And as I mentioned earlier, they don't like to be covered up with leaves. But in that maintenance of the leaves, you don't have to blow every day. You just
Mm,
don't need to leave them on for an entire season.
right.
And there are special ways to do that maintenance. Um, you should you can still blow on high once the mosses are established, but you use a figure eight motion or jerky actions versus long, steady blows. And it's
Gotcha.
better to blow when everything's wet. Wet leaves will blow away just fine. Wet mosses will be less likely to blow away
Makes
during
sense.
that process. But what happens if you do happen to blow away a moss? You just pick it up and you put it in your frag bag. You either replace it back where you had it, or, like I said, put it in your frag bag so that you can plant it elsewhere.
Okay. And so, how is that? You talked about the fragmentation. How is that? You mentioned a couple of different methods. You mentioned fragmentation, the cookie sheet method. Are those two different kinds of methods, or is that one? And then you also have the moss milkshake, which maybe you can touch on a little bit too.
Oh, you had to bring that milkshake up. Oh, my Lord. That is the biggest moss myth that exists on the internet.
Okay.
Now, it's based on the botanical fact that I've already mentioned. Mosses can grow from frags or
Mhm.
fragments of the plants. They don't need buttermilk. My Lord, they attach themselves. All you got to do is water and walk on them.
Okay.
So the milkshake method is haphazard. It could work, but you could have maybe just put frags down and it worked just as well without ruining
Okay.
a blender, without buying buttermilk, without attracting unwanted critters to your yard that will want to come and lick that buttermilk. Now, I did an experiment with it on a variety of substrates, and my dog loved it. He ruined my experiment completely. The other
And
thing is that typically, if you're painting on a mixture, it will wash away um, or get too hot. People that want to do vertical walls and the ones that appear on the internet are just flat out fakers. They they are they're presenting a product that appears to have grown on the wall, even using the word grow. And I'm going, look at how even those edges are. Mosses don't have pristine cut edges. So
right.
you can achieve vertical walls, but you need to start them up sideways and then hang the panel up after the fact.
Gotcha. So, in other words, don't believe everything you see on the internet.
Wow, what is amazingly, you
Amazing.
understand that. Uh, but I think that probably anybody that has success with the milkshake method could have been successful with the species uh, in their location anyhow. But
Right.
that's the other problem with the milkshake method is that they just say use moss. Well, what moss do you want to use?
Hmm.
Which one's going to grow in that location? What? Uh, can't just use any moss. And there are certain ones that I can tell you, if you put them in your blender, they just tangle up. It'd just be a terrible mess. Uh, so
Buttermilk and moss.
I definitely am not a supporter of the moss milkshake idea. In fact, it gets on my nerves. I can't believe you asked me that question. Okay, there. Uh,
So let's get back to the cookie sheet method.
all right. Cookie sheet is what I refer to as using colonies of mosses that are hand sized. They can be as big as a pancake or maybe even a frisbee. That's your choice, whatever size. It could be small, like a landscaper would use, like little plugs.
Right.
But you need to choose your moss species based upon the sun exposure first, and
Right.
then the challenges of solving erosion control or water mitigation. So
Hmm.
the cookie sheet is used colonies, and then you spread fragments in between.
Mm.
That's the next version. or you can use just fragments or frags. Now, it's real important. I've alluded to the fact that some mosses grow upright and some grow sideways. Literally, you are not going to get the expansion from your cookies or pancakes, whatever you want to call them, unless you're using a sideways grower. Now,
Right.
as your frags, you can put anything in the middle. And you can still use upright growers, but you better have some sideways growers
Hmm.
adjacent to it if you want it to fill in.
Right. So if I'm understanding this correctly, you're using pancake size pieces of moss and you're putting them on a cookie sheet, I guess the idea of a cookie sheet, but you're spreading the fragments as crumbs around these islands of pancake size moss. Am I understanding that right?
Yes, you are. That's
All right.
correct. With the purpose of making sure that you include sideways growing species in the
Correct. Okay.
process. And
And
once
then
again, the supplemental watering will speed that process up.
that was my next question, watering and then walking on it.
Walking helps you get the rhizoids attached to the substrate. The substrate, in most cases in landscaping, will be soil.
So where do you find and you mentioned a little bit in your book about how there's been a lot of development in Western North Carolina and a lot of, properties scheduled for demolition. Where do you find your moss that for these, cookie sheet methods or fragments? And do you find moss when you do find moss, if it's in a sunny spot, is that your key indicator that okay, this is going to be a good moss to put to replant in a sunny area?
Okay, you asked several questions in there. First, I'll address the where do I find mosses? I keep my eye open, and I have gained uh, a reputation to where people know I'm the moss lady. And if
Right.
they see an opportunity, such as mosses growing on a roof, then they alert me. And
Mhm.
then I go and ask permission. I do want to just put one word out here of admonishment and discouragement about entering any of our protected national forests and parks.
Thank you.
Please do not steal from our forests. Now, that doesn't mean that opportunities still don't exist there.
Right.
And I have been lucky enough to have the chief ranger call me up from one of the local um, or the state parks nearby that has waterfalls, lots of waterfalls. And they're getting ready to make a new parking lot. Annie, do you want to
Oh.
come get the moss? Yes, sir. I sure do. So sometimes people contact me. Other times I will see it. I will go knock on somebody's door and ask them if I can have their moss, particularly from roofs, because most
Mhm.
people don't want it.
Right.
And if I can't, if they're not home, I'll ask the neighbor. If not, I take the address and I go to the county office and get the information about how to contact them.
Oh, wow.
So, um, and then I'm licensed as a plant harvester by the state of North Carolina
Okay.
uh, through the NCDA, and also as a nursery to ship mosses around the country. So,
Oh, wow.
and to top that off, I have $1 million liability insurance policy. So when homeowners are hesitant, I just say, "Oh, well, I don't know whether that'll be safe or something." I say, "I'm covered. You don't have to worry about any liability. The average person is not going to have that kind of insurance coverage, but that is part of my business model. It is to rescue mosses from wherever they're going to be destroyed. Oh my gosh, one place can be along highways in the DOT area that they
Hmm.
mow. And I will tell you, I went back to the site a couple of days ago where I've gotten incredible dicranum colonies, and
Wow.
some big DOT equipment came through with huge tires, discombobulated an
Uh,
entire long area of
uh,
mosses. So they're not appreciated by most people, and certainly not people that are into the mow and blow concept that most landscapers provide to homeowners,
right.
or that the state or federal or even local governments utilize in their processes of choosing plants. Mosses could stabilize those hills. Mosses could be the answer. Mosses could definitely be the answer out there where they're concerned about the flooding of the Mississippi and being able to um, encourage better air quality and
Hmm.
soil quality. And they're letting plants go fallow to help with that process. And I'm just sitting here, little old Mossin Annie, going, well, if you created sphagnum peat bogs, they can handle the sun, they can handle the ebb and flow of the water.
Right.
And here's the best part, and I will wave a big green moss flag. Mosses, sphagnum as a genus has over 200 species, but the sphagnum peatlands cover 2 to 3% of the world's land mass. That's like saying just maple trees or acres cover it. It's one genus of plants. It's
Wow.
not, anyhow, that's to me amazing. Well, what's the benefit of that? Well, are you a tree hugger, Mark?
I would say so.
Okay. Would you like to protect those forests down in South America?
Sure.
Well, me too. But guess what? The mosses sequester twice as much carbon
It's a
as
huge carbon
all
sink.
of the forests put together
Get
in the
out of here.
world.
Get
Yes.
out of here.
And
Wow.
that statistic actually is going upwards um, as people become more aware. Oftentimes, mosses are truly overlooked in plant inventories.
Yeah.
Um, they can be the first to reintroduce after a fire, the first plants
Wow.
to reintroduce after a fire.
Wow.
But when you look at the plant list, it doesn't include a single bryophyte on it. It's like they just didn't notice. Oh, I went to a fire and here's that rhododendron. You just can't hardly kill rhododendron. And it was stubbed out, but it was starting to grow back already. And there was Atricum angustatum sitting right next to it. Those were the only two things that had survived the fires. Uh, but they hadn't been listed. But anyhow, that's a problem in that because they're ignored by scientists, and frankly, biologists study taxonomy, they're not familiar with how to grow bryophytes or mosses successfully.
Hmm.
And then the horticulturalists sure know how to grow that grass. Down at NC State, they've got hundreds of field trial experiments for turf grass. And when I inquired about the bryophyte experimentation, they just looked at me like I was a crazy woman.
Yeah.
And uh, it just hasn't been embraced. So there's lots of research that should be done. Uh, in my opinion, I have a long list of projects and
Mhm.
information that I would like to have verified. But my observations and recommendations are based not just on theory, but on actual being in the woods and seeing how they grow. And this is going to refer back to if you find one that's growing in the sun, does that mean it'll be good for the sun? Yes, it
Yeah.
probably does. If
Right.
you find it growing in the shade and it's that very same species, oh my goodness, it must be versatile and can live in the shade or the sun.
Ah, yes.
And then there are species that are very specific to only the shade.
Okay.
So I wanted you to be aware of that. Identifying the sun exposure is critical to any successful moss growth and the choice of appropriate species. So, if you're in the sun, then Polytrichum, Ceratodon, Leucobrium, Hedwigia, Entodon are some of the species that come to mind immediately. And within that group, I've included sideways growers as well
Hmm.
as upright growers. And
Okay.
then we've got versatile species that can live in any circumstance you want to put them in. And then, as I mentioned, there are a few that are truly just shade lovers.
I have a Y-shaped walkway. It's about 100 feet and it goes through my garden. and the stones had sunk about 3 inches below the grass. And it's flanked with grass on the other side. So I bought a lot of bags of sand, and I spent too much time elevating these stones back up to the level of the grass. And so it's got their stones are surrounded by grass. There's about 2 inches between the stones, and the stones are let's say the size of a I don't know, they're 2 by 2, 2 foot square stones. Um,
How thick are
and
they?
an inch or two. They're
That makes a
not.
big difference. If they're too thin, stepping stones will break.
Oh yes,
You
no,
you
they're
need
good stones.
okay.
They're
All right.
good stones. It's just what's in between. And right now, there's just been sand, but of course, that sand is now filling in with weeds and other things that I don't want there. So, what should I do to get moss in there? And now it's 100 feet, so there are shady sections, there are sunny sections. What do you recommend in that setup?
Well, mosses can be planted in between the gaps or in the gaps between the stones. They can also create a border that of
Right.
interest that separates the grass. I would be concerned about grass moving in on the moss. Now, the
Yes.
fact that you leveled your stones using sand rather than trying to do it with soil or dirt is is a good thing. What would be even better would be the use of granite dust.
Okay.
Sand is a good leveling agent, but it's also drains a,
Hmm.
a considerable amount. So mosses may dry out more on a sand base than they would if you used what is kind of what we call
Rock
chat
dust.
around here. Yeah, granite
Yeah.
rock dust.
Okay. And that you can buy at pretty much any masonry supply store for people I'm interested in. I picked up quite a bit of it myself. So,
Well, the
oh,
reason I mention that is that it allows moisture to permeate, but it also kind of hardens up, whereas sand just stays loose.
okay.
When it's wet, it seems kind of hard, but it's not.
Yeah.
So it doesn't harden to the degree that concrete. But if you had concrete joints in between your stones, I could plant mosses on that as well.
hmm I mean, I
Mosses
mean,
do not care. They're not going to derive any nutrients from the
let's
base or
believe them.
this, and it doesn't make any difference whether it's got
Yeah.
soil in there or not. Truly, it doesn't matter. Now, you do need to. Uh, it's tedious doing a path. I mean, you've already had to try to level things up. You
Yeah.
need to consider upright growers. Some will have soil attached to them,
hmm
and so you need to either elevate the depth or increase the depth to where you
hmm
adjust so that you can have a rather even
Gotcha.
growth pattern. So if you've got an upright grower that you're using, which is ideal for rocks because it will not spread onto the rocks, or if you're using a sideways grower, you need to have your soil level or your sand in your case up closer to the top of the stone itself. And you have to be really neat. You need to have a whisk broom and a little dustpan. You should
Okay.
keep your stones clean as you're planting. First, you should clean them off before you even start. And then, as you start to plant, you want to make sure each stone is kept clean. You sweep it off in the corner or you use your dustpan because you will want to walk on those gaps between the stones.
hmm
Or if they're too little, and believe you me, I have dealt with stone paths that can vary from a quarter of an inch to 4 or 5 inch gaps. And as you mentioned, you have the challenge of some parts are in the shade and some are in the sun. So you
Yeah.
would need to guesstimate how much. Typically, I will do the running length of a path, the width, and then factor in the shape and size of the stone, and then use a percentage. And I've been doing pretty good at guesstimating.
All
I
right.
will
Yeah, that's
say, uh, because and you can plant directly on, like some people have gravel paths. I
Hmm.
just did a project this past week where they had stepping stones with river rock, round river rock that you would use like as a dry bed where you would have
Hmm.
overflow watering. Well,
Right.
guess what? You step on those stones and you misstep, you're going to break your ankle on all those big round river rocks. I
Yeah.
looked at
Oh,
that.
yeah.
I said, this has to be fixed. I mean,
Yeah.
it was just dangerous. So I spent hours sorting through rocks that would be appropriate as flat rocks. And
Okay.
then uh, tossing the other ones to be used for another purpose. I actually staged some really nice hot dog and potato rocks to use for some kind of a feature on down the road.
All right.
Uh, but mosses can soften the hardscape so much, and uh, and they're walkable. You can walk on
Yeah.
that moss on the gravel.
Yeah.
So I went from uh, fixing the problem with the stepability and of the path to including moss, not just in the gaps, but all the way to the edges of the green oasis that I created in this brown pine needle
Nice.
abyss.
Nice. I mean,
You
that's what
saw,
attracted. I saw those are the pictures that you sent me.
right,
Yes.
right. That,
Yeah, it was beautiful. It's like night and day. Really
mm-hmm,
was. And I mean that's what got me into moss in the beginning is that you plant it grows in cracks. And so anybody that's a gardener has to deal with weeds and every day, and they grow and they regrow and they grow again. And I've got a brick pathway that's older, and I tried to put in it's not rock dust, but it's a sort of cement like
right.
substrate that's supposed to stay and prevent weeds from growing. It didn't work. But I've noticed that in areas of my yard where I do have moss that grew on its own, it doesn't grow very high. So you don't really need to maintain it in the same way that you would if you had, let's say, grass growing between the rocks. And it's beautiful. It's green and it doesn't turn brown in the wintertime. And it doesn't require pesticides. It sounds like to me, it's a win-win-win all around.
Well, it can be, but I need to clarify something. Mosses are not maintenance free.
Right. Yes. Can we
You
talk more
still
about that?
have to deal with the debris removal, and like I said, the gifts. It's not just the fall leaves that come off the trees. Trees
Yeah.
gift you with. I just went through football season at my mossery. It happens in late May and early June. And that's when the male catkins of pine trees fall, and they're
Ah,
like little brown footballs, and they can cover an area.
right.
The catkins from an oak tree, which are stringy, that people have probably encountered those at some time, can make a huge mess in a moss garden.
Mhm.
So you do want to deal with that removal of debris, but mosses play a role in the forest life cycle as the place where new plants can germinate. So if you think about the intention of mosses and the idea of weeds, they're still going to happen.
Yeah.
Mosses don't crowd weeds out necessarily. In fact, new ones can't will appear, and
Right.
tiny weeds that you never even noticed will be
Yeah.
obvious in some of these miniature moss species. So hand weeding may still be necessary. And you did mention that you don't need to use fertilizers. That's although some mosses might could benefit from a fertilizer since there's not been any adequate research. I mean, like almost zilch.
Okay.
Then you might choose the wrong nutrient or micronutrient to
Right.
encourage growth, or it might be detrimental to the moss. It would be haphazard in
Yeah.
that sense. So hand weeding can be a huge process for some people. And if you are willing to use a chemical, you can.
Yeah.
It's a little counterintuitive since mosses are so natural. But if
Right.
you're dealing with those obnoxious weeds, and some of them can be native, I will tell you, people do not want to ever say that native plants can be invasive. You can only use the word aggressive growers. Well, I can tell you what, Houstonia, which are these little bluets, and they're so cute, but they have little tiny roots that get into your mosses and can crowd them out. And they do turn brown. Um,
Mm,
and they look pretty when they're blooming, but that's about it. So I am
right.
constantly hand removing that. But if you need to use a chemical, you can use a product um, and called spectricide, weed
Hmm.
and grass killer. Make
Okay.
sure, and it can be bought right off the shelf. You do need to follow the directions. It should only be applied between 60 and 80 degrees. The plants and the mosses should not be stressed. In other words, you would not be spraying if you were going through a drought or days of dry
Uh,
weather or
okay.
extremely hot weather. You could um, go ahead and prep it by giving it an intentional watering, and you might need to use a surfactant, but within 15 minutes, it's according to the label, it's effective. Uh, and you will probably see death within 2 days, sometimes as long as a week. And
Hmm.
then it's much easier to pull out the larger weeds by hand. The little ones just disappear.
Oh, wow. Okay.
So,
So moss are not maintenance free, but they're lower maintenance than a lot of other things we tend to plant.
right. Well, you don't have to mow
That's for sure.
them. That's right.
I mean,
Oh,
that's the
and
beauty of it.
that's right. So, and if you're using a weed eater, I do want, and that's one way to maintain um, a mossy area, like on a bank where weeds and mosses are growing together, and it's too steep or a difficulty in terms of accessing the plants. Then you can use that weed eater, and you want to
Hmm.
weed eat them down as far as you can, and do it prior to when the seed pods are present on the weeds. If you weed eat while the seeds are ready to spread, you will just be encouraging that spreading of more weeds.
Oh
So
man.
the timing of weed eating is important if you're going to whack your weeds away. But you can maintain a beautiful landscape um, that is not totally pristine, but looks really good
Yeah. Yeah.
by just letting your mosses be there and just maintaining weed control with a weed eater.
I saw maybe we could talk a little bit about moss lawns. There's one near me and I drove by it. It was, I mean, it felt like you were in some sort of J.R.R. Tolkien Hobbit-like green, lush, verdant world. What are your thoughts on moss lawns? And do you think they'll catch on mainstream?
Okay, well, I'm a moss fairy, so I believe mosses are the answer to every single landscape challenge that you have. There is a bright moss for every place.
Okay.
However, most people um, actually suffer from what my grandmother used to say when we would go to the cafeteria. Your eyes are too big for your stomach. Well, the same thing comes to people that want moss. If you're looking out and you want your grass to be moss, then you've got to have the appropriate species. You better hope they're already growing on your property because you, in addition, will need a very big budget or need to spend lots of time finding legitimate, ethical rescue locations and doing it
Right.
yourself. It
Yeah.
can be an expensive proposition. So I'd like to say if you want to grow mosses and include them in your garden, start small.
Right.
Don't try to take on the biggest project of
Yeah.
all.
That's a
Now,
good
my
advice
house,
for life.
well, my yard when I moved in did have sod. I did not want grass at all.
Okay.
And
Yeah.
I started by creating focal features, skirting a tree with mosses, creating a spot where your eye can visually travel from inside the house to in the wintertime to a place that brings you pleasure. Or it could be an actual physical destination where you
Mhm.
create a seating area where you can enjoy your mosses. But start small, don't take on too much. Do I approve of moss lawns? Yes. My entire lawn is now moss. I did
Wow.
convert it over the years. In fact, I converted an asphalt driveway into a moss garden and didn't even have to take the asphalt out.
Wow.
I just
Okay.
planted it straight on. I did have
Wow.
a load of um, what's called fill dirt, meaning it is nutrient poor. Mosses don't care. They're not going to
Nope.
derive any
Right.
nutrients at all
We
from
learned
that.
that. We learned
And
that.
so, uh, and I planted that also to prove that you could plant in the dead of winter. And so I started in around Thanksgiving of 2008 and finished in early January of 2009. We are now in 2024, and I
Right.
am looking at that beautiful green expanse that has changed somewhat in terms of the
Hmm.
predominance of certain species. I've
Okay.
added in some new elements. I have put in some flowering plants to attract pollinators. However, mosses have been ignored in the pollinator world as how important they can be as well.
Really?
And I will say that when this you can see the moth, Moths, not Moss, flying out. They use them as a habitat. Hey, did you know about the ratio of moths to butterflies in the world?
No.
All
Tell
right.
us.
We give butterflies credit for all this wonderful pollination stuff. There's 20,000 species of butterflies.
Hmm.
There's 160,000 species of moths,
Wow.
Moths. So they're actively involved in pollinating as well, perhaps more so than anybody gives them credit. So,
Huh.
looking at nighttime plants that attract moths that are light in color versus some of the other ones that we associate with attracting pollinators. Now, and that can be very specific. I mean, sometimes it's not just, they're not generalists. They really, a specific butterfly species will only go to a specific plant.
Wow.
Um, at different stages. It may be the adult feeding or it may be the larva stage. So it's something that merits further study in
For
terms
sure.
of the role of mosses in that ecosystem of supporting our eventual food chain. And that's the reason for encouraging pollinators is to support our own food chain.
That's right. That's right. Well, tell us more about your business, Mountain Moss.
Well, actually, I think I still need to tell you about this subspecies versus sideways.
Please, please
That's
do.
that's
Yeah. I
just
mean,
so important. Okay.
that's the designing with mosses part of it. So let's get into that.
Okay. I mentioned you've got to choose them when you're assessing the sun exposure. Most gardeners think about what the sun's like in the summer because that's when all these other plants grow.
Right.
Mosses are going to grow year round. And up in Connecticut, just like down here in North Carolina, our leaf canopy probably is over about October, November at least.
Hmm.
I mean, all the leaves have fallen off by then, and it doesn't fill back in until late April, early May. And so that's a significant portion. That's almost 6 months of the year when you might have full sun exposure.
Yeah.
So you need to consider that. Certain moss species will be more um, susceptible to color shifts in those early spring months when the sun is intense and there's no
Hmm.
leaf canopy. For instance, Thuidium and Hypnum, which are both sideways growers, and they're commonly called fern mosses or
Hmm.
carpet mosses, or heaven forbid, in the floral world, sheet mosses. Now, you've lived in the South. That sounds like a cuss word, doesn't it? And it is. I mean, I do not I do not sell to florists. I don't sell to crafters. If I'm rescuing mosses to keep them alive to provide joy, then I have decided that having my own business is the way that I can maintain my professional ethics by choosing the ones that are appropriate and retrieving them in an ethical manner. All right, so you
Nice.
want to choose your sun species or your shade species. You can do that observation of where you find them growing, but like I mentioned, they could maybe grow elsewhere. So, utilizing reference sources and understanding which ones grow where can be important. And
Yeah.
I did write a book, The Magical World of Moss Gardening,
Sure did.
back in, it was published in 2015. And in 2017, Mark, they translated it into Japanese.
Oh, wow.
I know.
Okay.
How exciting for
That's
this
a
little.
real feather in your cap. I mean, Japan is really known for its intricate gardens, and that's really special.
Mm-hmm. Most definitely. But what you don't see in the photographs from Japan of those magnificent temple gardens uh, is that they're not going to show you anything when it's going through a transition and not looking good. Okay,
Aha.
but they
Right.
actually do have some of the same genus of moss species in Japan as we have here. All right,
Okay.
so I do want to make sure that we cover how you plant sideways growers.
Let's hear it.
Okay, so uh, upright growing mounds can just be plopped directly on the ground, and you can walk on them. You can sit on them if you need to, or in some cases, when I've had those paths or patios with small cracks, I will hammer them in. They don't
Okay.
care. Sounds like it's being mean, but I've already saved them from destruction, so
That's
they're
right.
they're
That's
happy
right.
with me. They know that I'm a caring moss mama, and so that is important. For sideways growers, you would want to interleaf the edges over, under. And then
Okay.
it's most important to walk along that seam or to press down firmly, as
Hmm.
my daddy taught me how to do things, with authority. You want to make sure that you've got it firmly in place. So literally back to your path, you just choose some shade ones for your shade areas, some sun ones, some versatile ones that can handle both circumstances. You level out your soil or your sand, as in your case,
Hmm.
either raising it or lowering it to suit the moss species that you've chosen for that area. Keep your little brisk whisk broom handy with your dustpan, and you can plant literally solid in all of those gaps between the stones. All right. So you can do that by plopping them down and pushing real hard out. And to also put the sideways growers, you can incorporate them into some of the upright mounds as well. Sometimes if
Oh,
there's
wow.
a gap left, I put a little tiny bit of interdon in there too, just because mosses are very social. They grow together. It's
Okay.
rare that you will have pristinely pure areas of moss. It may be
Right.
dominated by a species. You
Okay.
also need to be aware of those color changes. And I am jumping back to that. That's what I had forgotten to say, was that Hypnum and Thuinium will shift to yellow in the
Okay.
early spring when they don't have the leaf canopy. Now, unlike tree leaves, which fall off and make a mess, turn brown and die, moss leaves just shift back to green. They don't die
Nice.
at all. It is
That's
truly
nice.
just a color transition.
Wow.
There are a couple of times when yellow may be indicative of stress on certain species, but not in the case of typical Hypnum and some of the other mosses that are affected by that early spring sun.
Oh, wow.
All right,
All
now,
right.
now we can get on to the business if you want to.
Yeah, let's hear about Mountain Moss.
Let's get into the moss business here. Uh, I was motivated by rescuing mosses, but I have realized I was born to be a moss artist, Mark. I mean, this was the talent I was given.
Wow.
It took a while. I started making terrariums when I was 10 years old. But
Wow.
and then I decorated forest driftwood and did these creations. And then I thought, well, I want it everywhere. And when I moved back to the mountains from Atlanta, I took advantage of that. Although there are lots of mosses in Atlanta, I've done lots of site consults and projects down there
Mhm.
as well. So you don't have to be restricted by thinking you're in the pristine location, which I might be.
Mhm. Yeah.
Other people can grow it too. Because if you've got running water, and most people these days do,
Yes.
then you can have supplemental watering provided by you and not depend on Mother Nature.
Right.
And sometimes overwatering can be detrimental too. I just want to say certain moss species do not want to
Sure.
sog out.
Yeah. And so, it's interesting. I've gone to nurseries looking for moss, and you
Mm.
can't really find it. So, I mean, you have a really great niche. And I mean, do you ship all over the country?
Okay, first off, we better talk about fakers because there are moss fakers or imposters out there that they do
Okay.
sell at garden centers.
Ah,
One is called
interested.
Irish moss or
Okay.
Scotch moss.
Okay.
Actually, there is a native version of that, and it is one of the most obnoxious weeds that you can get in your moss. And
Oh.
believe you me, I pulled that stuff out immediately when I see it. Uh, but those, if they, Irish moss and Scotch moss come in a pot, they have
Mhm.
roots, and they got little white flowers. Ta da! Never a biophyte will
No,
ever have a
no
flower,
roots.
only a sporophyte. Now,
Hmm.
some of the rhizoids can fake you out because they look a whole
Right.
lot like roots
Aha.
to the average person, but they will never have a flower. All right, can you think of anything else that's called a moss that might not be one?
Not off the top of my head.
Well, think if you went down in the low country. What would you see hanging from the trees?
Oh, yeah, yeah. Spanish moss.
Yes, okay. It's not a moss at all either, or a bryophyte. It's actually
Right.
related to the pineapple family.
Uh, okay.
And
All right.
it's more of an epiphytic, and there are some epiphytic mosses, but in that case, it just happens to be a plant called moss that is not really moss. Club mosses, which I'm sure when you were in school at Appalachian, you went hiking in the woods, you could
Oh, yeah.
see all kinds of club mosses. Hupersia, which is shining club moss that sticks out
Hmm.
like fingers from underneath rocks, or princess pine or running ground cedar are other examples of quote club mosses that are really lycopods. Uh, then there's reindeer moss, and
Okay.
reindeer moss is kind of gray green. Some of them are whitish, some even have a little purplish hint, and it's actually a lichen. In North Carolina, we have over 50 species of Cladonia lichens. And one
Hmm.
of the specialty ones that I'm sure you couldn't help but notice on a hike in the woods is one that we commonly call British soldiers. It's a little red topped lichen. And its real name is Cladonia cristatella. So when you start learning these scientific names, they really can be quite pretty as well as informative.
Yeah.
And I avoid the use of the common names because somebody asks for like carpet mosses. Well, there's lots of different carpet mosses, ones that grow sideways like a
Hmm.
carpet. There are plenty of mosses that are cushion shaped, and so just defining one species as being pincushion, well, frankly, Luke O'Brien, I've got a specimen colony. He's about 2 feet long by a foot tall. He ain't any little old pincushion anymore. Uh, so I do avoid that. Now, as for my business, um, I am licensed to ship, but I have just recently eliminated 26 states because of the
Oh,
requirements that they have for the treatment of the mosses to avoid the spread of Japanese beetles.
I
Mind you,
see.
Japanese beetles don't like the taste of moss either. The insects just don't like the taste of moss. That's why
Yeah,
it's not a problem. You don't have to deal with those typical pests
right.
that can be annoying in gardens. But I'm not willing to use the chemicals. I just
Okay.
don't want to.
Good for you. Yeah.
So I just decided I would have to eliminate the states. So
Wow.
unfortunately, half of the country I don't ship to anymore.
Okay. All
But
right.
I do ship moss trays and moss mats. The trays contain 1.25 feet of
Okay.
mosses,
Wow.
and my moss mats are 36 square feet. That's a 6 by 6 foot moss
Wow.
carpet that you can
Wow.
roll out. Um, and and then you don't even have to worry about those weeds, Mark. You can just roll that landscape
Right.
fabric right on top of it as geotex that I
So I mean,
use as my base substrate.
it's almost like sod. It's like moss sod in a way.
Kind of. Oh Lord,
Wow.
I have to look at the real sod fields all the time, and I guess
Yeah.
I didn't get into the money making business because they have
Well.
3 harvests of sod along the river.
Wow.
I also watch the pollution that occurs here
Oh, it's
near the
terrible.
headwaters of
Oh,
the French Broad River that
yeah.
travels through from Devil's Courthouse up on the parkway. It starts up there in the spring and it winds through Transylvania County, where Brevard is located, and on to Asheville, continues north. It is a north flowing river till it
Okay.
reaches the Mississippi. And that pollution is happening right up here at the very beginning. It's
Oh,
a shame.
yeah.
I mean, so
Yeah.
can I support grass? No. I do I want everybody to have moss lawn? Yes.
Yes.
So
Yes.
please try
Yes.
to have it if you can. It not on
Yes.
it just helps eliminate a lot of issues that are related to the health of our environment.
It really is. I mean,
Mm.
there's so much good about moss. They're beautiful. They're, lower maintenance, not maintenance free, and as we made pretty clear today, and that not very little pesticides. So sod versus a moss lawn, it's just night and day in terms of the benefits to the environment. So
But even
thank
just a moss feature will make your heart sing.
you. Yeah,
I
it really
mean,
does.
it's really worth it. My life as a mosser is a good life, I will
Yeah,
say.
yeah,
Uh, I may not be making the money that the sod folks do, but my life is so much better.
yeah.
And uh,
Let's put it this way, nobody's taken down a fireplace to look on their expansive side.
well, I don't know. There's some pretty fanatic people out there about their grass, I will
That's
say.
true. That's true.
But I do share my expertise that I've developed and my knowledge. Um, I'm not a bryologist. I'm just like you. I was just a regular person that just liked moss and wanted to learn more about it. And I have been uh, privileged to become uh, friends with bryologists from around the world.
Wow.
And so they have shared their expertise with me in terms of species, but they don't know much about how to grow them. And so I
Hmm.
had to really do most of that on my own. Not
Wow.
and from observations, but then the real proof of the pudding is whether it lasts or not.
There you
You
go.
can plant anything, but can you keep it alive?
Right.
And so I offer site consultations in person, and then I do phone or Zoom conversation
Oh, wow.
as well to
Terrific.
help advise people. And of course, Mountain Moss, as a professional landscaping team, knows how to plant mosses, and we do lots of different installations.
And you have a YouTube channel as well.
Oh, yeah, I do YouTube. I've got a Facebook group called Go Green with Moss that has over 6,000 members. Now, mind
Wow.
you, I don't moderate it anymore. We'll thank Rodney Holcomb, my best Moss star student ever, who has to answer that Moss milkshake question a lot.
God bless him.
I will say that that is the most asked question at all of my lectures. I give lectures and workshops around
Okay.
the country
Great
as
to hear.
well.
All right.
And uh, so I like to nip it in the bud and explain that it's a haphazard method. As a professional landscaper, you certainly would not want to depend upon it. And can you imagine how many blenders it would take to do a lawn?
It sounds
I
like
mean,
something developed by the blending industry to get people to buy an extra blender to destroy.
well, like I said, it's based on botanical fact that mosses can grow from fragments of the plants.
Yeah,
It's just not the best way to achieve it.
yeah,
And
yeah.
my recommendations are from an aesthetic point of view and from a practical point of view as well. For instance, I mentioned my giant leucobrium specimen colony. It
Hmm.
deserved a place of honor because in my garden, and so it's sitting on a pedestal. It's 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 a beautiful place to showcase it, but it's high enough that my dog can't cock his leg on it either.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
I think I better mention that your own dog could cause damage. Mosses can dislodge
Hmm.
um, from dogs running across the lawn or, of course, digging. That's pretty obvious. Even landscapers who wear big clunky boots can cause damage to mosses. But mosses can be walked on. I would say that if it's super wet, don't have your garden tour on that day. I mean,
Fair enough.
because wet mosses that are trampled on will take much, much longer to recover.
All right. And we talked a lot about the book. The book is called The Magical World of Moss Gardening, and it's really the Bible for it is. If you want one book about mosses, this is the one to get. So, and it's been translated to the Japanese. So if you speak Japanese and you want to practice, there you go. So, well, Annie, it's been great having you on the show. Any final thoughts?
Yes, I do have a final thought.
Let's hear
We've
it.
talked about some of the practical aspects of choosing your mosses, looking at your overall canopy, choosing based on if you're going to try to solve a problem, for instance, water runoff down a steep hill. But and the aesthetics, the design concept, how you blend and create interest. But there's one other really important aspect, and that's the spiritual connection. And I believe that mosses offer an opportunity for us to learn. We may not hear their voices, but perhaps we can learn from the plants that have outlived every single thing on this planet.
A
And
lot
it's
to be
not going to
said.
be kudzu that survives, it'll be mosses again.
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah,
they have watched the dinosaurs come and go. But when I plant, I think it's important. First of all, these are mosses that I have personally rescued in most cases. So I know where
yeah.
they came from and that they're
Right.
getting a better place to live. But I plant in love and in honor of someone that you care about. Or perhaps it was the previous ancestors that had been on the land. I did a project down in Georgia one time that had originally been a plantation. I raised that moss garden up to the folks that worked on that piece of land a couple of 100 years ago. We've got something beautiful there that
Yeah,
is, in my mind, a reminder of the toils and the labor that occurred there.
yeah.
So, and sometimes it's just in honor of your mother on Mother's Day. Make her a special moss garden. Or your
All right.
daddy. Father's Day's coming up soon, too.
That's for
But
sure.
plant
Well,
in good spirit
yeah,
and uh, and follow tried and true methods that work. Beware of myths that are promoted, such out there on the internet, and look for people that really have had success with Mossin.
yeah,
And some of them, like your neighbor down the street, might have just stopped fertilizing the grass, started mowing it down. It could have been a natural transition that occurred rather than
Right.
an intentional planting.
Right, right. All right. Well, there's a lot of different ways to grow moss, and it's a fascinating species. And please, we need more of it. So, thank you, Annie, for being the moss evangelist for all of us. So,
Thank you, Mark. I appreciate this opportunity to share
yeah, it's great having you on the show.
my enthusiasm as I advocate for the benefits of mosses in your
All right.
landscape.